Hello and welcome to the sidelines of Pondy Lit Fest 2023. I have this morning with me Professor Aloke Kumar from the Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore. Alok famously introduced me to the idea that space habitation was a possibility with making bricks out of lunar soil and Mars soil simulants. So that was my entry into where science can go with technology and almost colonizing space. So, so yeah, that's where science can take you. So, Alok, my first question to you, because you often talk about the excellence required in pursuit of science, and yet whenever we have a space mission, the almost the byline is that it is cheap. So, what is your opinion on this? Is it an achievement of India to go cheap? Does it have any sort of fallout?
It's not. I mean, yeah, this is very famous, right? I mean, we have had this conversation in very different forms. Like the amount of money that was spent was cheaper than, let's say, on a kilometer basis, the cab price from one location to some location, uh, etc. So many such examples have come forth, and we have always been, as a nation, been very focused on this issue of price and how that our missions are so much cheaper than NASA, right? So this is actually not a good thing at all. I mean, this is something that is very detrimental. But let me, before I say go on more about that in a little bit more detail, I'd like to contextualize this. So when I'm saying it's not a good thing at all, I mean from a vision point of view for the entire nation. I don't mean it in the sense that if, let's say, you and me are sitting down and two friends are talking over coffee about whether we can make a mission cheaper or not, whether we can make something more efficient, is that a problem? No, not at all. That's great, and that's fantastic. That's a conversation that can definitely be had. It's a problem when you, as a national consciousness, you strive for something that is cheaper, right? There is a connotation to this. See, the word cheaper is always relativistic, right? You are cheaper than somebody else, so you are never first. You are the second or the third or fourth, or maybe much later, right? So you are much down below in the ladder, uh, always. So if your national consciousness is always to be cheaper, then you're not really looking to be first in anything. You're not really looking to be pioneering anything. Cheap is not a luxury that the first have. Cheap with respect to what? Uh, so I'm sure even the USSR budgets, NASA budgets for the moon mission, etc., they were not cheap by any standards. But they were also not, they were more expensive than many of the science missions that they had carried out at that point. But they were not looking to compete with somebody on the aspect of price. But there was this much larger vision that was set, right? For the USSR, they achieved significant grades in the domain of space technology. They had the first rover on the moon. They landed the missions to Venus. They were the first to do that. They landed missions on Mars. I'm sure that didn't happen because they were always looking for a cheap budget. The national consciousness was always for a certain goal. Like, let's venture out into space. Let's be explorers. Let's do something first. Similarly for the US, right? US had sort of fallen sort of behind, and then they wanted to outcompete them, and they said, okay, what can we do? So in the national consciousness, they decided that, okay, we'll put the first man on moon, right? So this itself was the goal. Whether what price is required, etc. We know that for many of the space missions, the initial estimates are often wrong. They're wrong because they're the first. They just don't know how much it will cost. It's not that the people are incompetent. So if you are always looking to strive to become cheaper, you're always looking to be second or third, usually even below that ladder, right? So you're always looking uh, uh, to compare yourself with some other pioneer. The other problem that is there is a government organization need not be cheap. Cheap is something that the private sector should think about. They should think about how to make a technology which is already demonstrated, something that is already known, accessible to the common person. So for them, sasta and tikau, that idea works. But for the government, when they are looking into funding some of these work, cheap is not something that they necessarily need to look into. They need to look into they should allow for various schools of thought in that area to compete with each other to see which one is better. That automatically means that there will be some amount of inefficiency. You will be funding maybe 3 people or 4 people or 5 groups for the same thing, and one of them will win. So it's totally fine. So this this should not be a national narrative that we are cheap. I think that's important to get to understand. But again, this is from the national narrative point. I'm not saying that on a personal level you cannot have that discussion, or maybe even in a research group, people cannot think about how to not have too many inefficiencies. That's not a problem. That's totally fine. And for the private sector, yeah, I mean, for them, they do want to make things cheap. I mean, that's what Elon has done in some ways. That SpaceX has made launching into space cheaper. So that's fine for something like that.
So, but also, is there another implication that when you aim for the cheap, does that also compromise on complexity of research, on complexity of the type of payload you send out? Does it have a direct impact on that?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely, it does. Because as I said, right, when it's the government which is funding it, it's the government's job to fund frontier research. Space technology obviously is a frontier research area. There, we don't necessarily know what is the right way to do something. So there, you must inculcate this habit of funding, of at least having in the beginning multiple approaches to the same thing. You must be able to you must tolerate failure, because they're the first. They don't necessarily.
Yeah, that was
know.
my follow-up question, because if it's cheap also, like for instance, does it give us the confidence that we can actually afford to fail, and we can, or that should not be a consideration? When you go for the research, go full on, and failure is an outcome of more learning.
So for space,
Yeah,
we should not try to be cheap, or even say that our failures are cheap or failures are affordable. If you're looking for affordable failures, space is not for us. That's not the domain they should be looking at. So if the national narrative is that let's make failures affordable, then I think we should keep our hands off space technology totally. So
okay. So you clearly think that the cheap should not be an end in itself at all. So that's one thing that's established. Now, but one of the first writings that I read of yours was an article in Swarajya where you and Ronojoy talked about this Indian capacity of jugaad that we have. And again, your views are quite contrarian, because we sort of we like the fact that we managed to make do. So what is your angst with jugaad? Why do you think does it lend to mediocrity? What is your angst with it?
Jugaad has been celebrated. And it's not just in the minds people or just ordinary discussion. There are books out there which celebrate Jugaad innovation and how supposedly it enables grassroots innovation. We know that's not true. That's not true because, again, first and foremost, the pioneers. If you are wanting to be okay, maybe let me rephrase that a little bit. The way you know that something is a product of jugaad and not of really critical innovation is in the way of that the product of jugaad is usually not scalable. Right? That's the first characteristic you can go for. It's also not, at a product scale, it's usually not robust. Second, it's not usually scalable. Now, why would you want to go for jugaad? Because engineering by itself is an endeavor to make things cheaper and simpler over time. It has happened everywhere. I mean, it's the history of technology that things have become simpler, cheaper, and more available. And look at the phone that you're holding, right? There was a time when a middle-class citizen of this country would never think that they could afford a phone, but today you can. Today we have in India you have access to data packages that are much better than many of what we'll get if you travel to a foreign country. So this automatically comes when you have engineering at scale, right? The cell phone is not a product of jugaad. It's a product of engineering. And in the beginning, obviously, the first movers are usually always expensive. We know that the initial Blackberries, etc., I would see it only in the hands of a select group of people. But then people started to figure out how these designs have to be done, how the electronics has to be managed, etc. And then you end up becoming cheaper because you start to become good at it. Engineering, usually manufacturing and engineering, once it moves to scale, once it has been done repeatedly over some time, it automatically tends to become cheap. Innovation in general tends to make things cheaper. Look at where SpaceX is coming from. It's not coming from a country where they look for cheap or jugaad, right? Why did that happen? But SpaceX today is challenging most other spacefaring nations in affordability. But never would we associate SpaceX or Elon with jugaad mentality, right? But they are pioneers. Today, they are so much cheaper that they are threatening ISRO's market share. And we know that. They are cheaper, they're significantly cheaper than NASA costs. And they're cheap enough that even ISRO is beginning to rethink its strategy, right? So, and in the history of technology, maybe I'll give you one more example. Simple, some of the affordable medical diagnostics that are coming. Today, you can measure blood sugar by just going to a store, buying this small instrument and measuring using it. These instruments have not come from countries or from research endeavors that wanted jugaad, because they are not scalable. You want robustness, right? When you want a technology at the level of people, you want it to be a very robust technology. You want it to be a technology that can work in a variety of circumstances, that's robust, that gives the correct results. That automatically requires a lot of thinking, a lot of product making, a lot of tests, a lot of failures, a lot of design changes. So the product that usually ends up with the public, they tend to be the product of something that has been ongoing for a long time. So engineering in general is an endeavor, or automatically endeavors. It's not something that engineers tend to think about, but this is, I'd say, maybe even an emergent property of engineering, that things tend to become cheaper, better over time, because people just become better at understanding how to get things done.
So, but then, I still have to ask you this question, and I want your version of the answer, because, as many answers, that much better is my argument. And that is, you talked of frontier science. So the layman on the street who doesn't have a toilet, I have to use that image, will wonder how does frontier science help me? Why is the government spending so much on frontier science? So what is your explanation to those who think that, oh, there is poverty in India, oh, everybody doesn't yet have access to good primary education or a clean toilet? How does it justify a space program, even though one of the sad USPs is that we are the cheaper, it's not that expensive. But then what is your explanation to this? How will you convince a people that we need to do this?
So this is usually a difficult conversation, usually with people, because space technology usually is futuristic, right? So the results of the endeavors will not show up today or maybe even tomorrow, but decades later. This happened with Vikram Sarabhai, right? So Vikram Sarabhai imagined a spacefaring India at a time when India was really, really poor. We had just become a nation, and I'm sure that if you went around with getting an opinion poll of people, whether people want to do science or toilets or food, right? At that time, India was suffering from so many different types of crises. Nobody would have voted for that. But then some people had the vision, they believed in it. And look at Vikram Sarabhai's efforts today. He believed that we need to monitor weather. We need to have our own satellite constellations. We should endeavor to So, he was a very big proponent of science being for the good of the society. So he automatically thought about satellites, uh, communication with rural hubs, so cities, doctors, etc., could communicate with people in rural places. Obviously, this didn't come to fruition during his lifetime. But today, look at where we stand. We are truly, if India has pioneered something, I think it's the digital age. Right? We have really been at the forefront of it, and all that has been enabled by what ISRO and many of these even private companies have done for Indian space sector. We would not have our satellites. We would not be so good at making them. We would not have our own constellation. We'd be buying from somebody else, be reliant on somebody else. So it's immediate, right? Currently, so now you can say, oh, look, we have already made all the satellites. So we are good at this. Let's stop. This is good enough. But the reality is it's not so. There are many different. So today it looks like Chandrayaan-3 is just a science mission. People are science and technology demonstrator. What good will it serve the country may not be immediately obvious other than from a sense of enthusiasm and pride that, oh, look, we made it. But maybe 20 to 30 years later, when the Earth's resources are really starting, we know it's dwindling now. 20 years later, it will be worse. 30 years later, it will be worse. We may be looking into space for some of these resources. And I'm talking about things like space mining, etc. These are still futuristic concepts today. We are not very sure of the economics of it, whether it will work out. But if it does work out, the nations which will be there will be the winners. And those who are not will be permanent losers. So we are fast moving into an age where you have the technology is changing, we know, and we have been accustomed to the internal combustion engine car for so long, but now that's moving away into a whole different area with electric cars. It may look same on the exterior, but in the interior, there's so many things that are different. If we do not have access to good battery technology, materials for these futuristic cars and many other technologies, India would be left behind. So if you don't start today, you cannot do this once everybody has gone there and found this. So it just doesn't happen.
So you have to start the research way before. You might not be able to immediately justify in terms of fruition why you're doing the research, but then that would put us back that much, because by the time the time comes to use the future technology, we would not even have had research had we not invested.
Right. So you can always only justify it in a past sense. Like Vikram Sarabhai's vision at that time, it was a poor India, but look where he got up.
I think that's even the question would have been more pressing in those times, because then India was really poor. It's baffling that we ask that question today when we don't take international aid, no matter what the British might want to think, you know.
Yeah, there was the whole thing about
exactly, you know, and it turned out to be that they invest in our country rather than give us aid because they need to. And so, you know, that question may have been pertinent, but again, thank God somebody financed that. Somebody had the vision to dare to think, and the government to finance it, so that it came to what it is today.
Right.
You know,
so I'm sure at that time not too many people believed in him. I mean, we know Homi Bhabha believed him, you know, because he constituted the first committee and put him in charge of the space, the INCOSPAR. But it was such a poor country. What was the literacy rate in that country at that time? Would people who even have understood what space missions would be and what the satellites would be doing? So somehow space is not a democratic contest. We are not always, to be pioneers, you cannot always be going around asking for an opinion poll and seeing whether these missions have the support. But thankfully, this is where I think the Indian masses, in some sense, are quite enlightened. Look at the enthusiasm Chandrayaan-3 got. Nobody's going around asking, oh, is it going to get me a cheaper, is petrol going to be cheaper tomorrow? Are my onions going to be cheaper tomorrow? But people generally had a sense of pride. I mean, this was just something for us, everybody to observe. We have been here, we have seen it, right? So in some sense, I find there are pockets which ask this question, but by and large, I think the Indian...
Yeah, they are, I think, fossilized. I think I still had to ask you the question because I wanted your version of the answer. But I think that that voice that keeps on questioning every time, we have poverty, we have illiteracy, they should also know that we've also moved from poverty and illiteracy, and we are continuing to move. And technology only helps dissemination. So, we can't retard us.
The other thing is also that you have to inspire people, right? I mean, we have people have been complaining about brain drain, but people are attracted to things that are inspiring, things that are that awe you. They fill you with a sense of awe. Wow, look, wow, what it is. People in technology, we have usually never. The first question is always of what is its utility. Sometimes it's about awe. So space is one thing that really inspires. It has been inspiring us from the beginning, I think, right? From the time we stepped out of the caves and started looking up at the stars, it has been inspiring us. So, and it will
Alok,
continue.
incidentally, is an avid stargazer and an amateur astrophotographer also. So, yeah.
It's my newfound hobby. I love it. I mean, I loved it in the beginning, but now I've gotten good at it.
So now, we hear of space age 2.0. What defines space age 2.0?
Yeah, so this is, I don't know how formal this term is, but this term has been I've seen it being thrown around quite a few different places. So the first space age, what it means, it looks at it in the context of the US specifically, space age 1.2 to 1.0 and 2.0. So say space age 1.0 was the time when it was the government which heavily invested in space. So it was basically NASA going around and many of the national labs, universities participating in it, most often through government aids, government grants. And that was the first era of space in some sense. And then now you can see this plethora of private companies which are becoming interested entrepreneurs who are starting startups on bizarre, what we'd think of as bizarre of targets for the private sector, but they have gotten so much interested in the space domain, so that we have this huge body of people who are now interested and wanting to take over some of the things from the government. So, for example, there are companies which want to take over the International Space Station's work. It has already started happening. There is no sharp boundary as such, but there is this transition where private enterprises are becoming more and more involved in research. So Space Age 2.0 basically denotes the entry of private entrepreneurship in a very big way into the space domain.
Would that also facilitate funding? Does private funding, I've always asked this question, does private funding usually is also very result oriented? So does that narrow your scope of research? Do you feel limited? Do you have private funders who give you that bandwidth of error, bandwidth of possibilities of research? Is that something that the private sector has in its imagination and investment?
So private sector, more often than not, I mean, there have been charismatic individuals who give out this aura of being funding so many different things, like Elon. It looks like he's funding so much of. People come up to me and ask all sorts of questions about are these the kind of things SpaceX is doing? But usually, it's not the job of the private sector to fund basic research or even blue sky work, and they usually don't. They are there to make something efficient, something that has already been known, something that's already been tested to some extent. Again, there are pluses. There are different types of entrepreneurs. Some entrepreneurs put their money on things that are not fully tested. For example, SpaceX did with the reusable vehicles. It's not that they were the first to come up with the idea, but it was not tested at that scale and demonstrated. But these guys did. But still, the private sector usually will not have the appetite to be funding research. You want them in the second wave, never in the first wave, and you don't want them to be dictating everything in research. So universities, etc., still should be, the government should be much willing to fund them and look after their needs. The private sector is usually in for the second wave where things are known. So now we have demonstrated PSLV some n number of times.
Yeah, that's a mastered technology.
It's a master technology. So now you can let a private sector come in and say, why don't you build this? We don't need to build this PSLV anymore. GSLV also, LVM Mark III now has a pretty good record. It will have a better record in another 5 years. you can ask the private sector to come and take it over, make it more efficient, etc. Maybe increase the payload capacity with the current technology. But then the government enterprises like ISRO and CSIR labs and university should move on to other targets.
Okay, now India has, it's among the top 4 now with some of its missions. And why do you think that is India on a solitary mission? Is there interest in other countries also to root for India's success? What do other countries stand to gain when we do well?
Okay, this is good. This is a very good question, and I would say, see, the history of the world has many different players throughout time. But at least in the last 400, 500 years, usually the countries which developed pioneering technology got ahead and much, much ahead than other uh, nations which didn't get that technology, which is okay at times, but sometimes it is to the detriment of the human civilization. But I would say, look at the role India has played. I mean, look, and I would just go back even to Aryabhata's time when they invented zero. This traveled through the Arab world to the rest of the world, and it laid the foundations of the mathematics the way we do mathematics today. So, and if you look at it now, fast forward it to the coronavirus pandemic. Let's look at India's role in this. What obviously it was a panic situation and a pandemic crisis all over the world. What solved that crisis? Vaccines. There are only a handful of manufacturers of that, handful of countries which had the technology. India was luckily one of them. By the way, that's also because companies like Serum Institute, SII, Serum Institute of India, invested in research much, much earlier, decades earlier than this. But once they did, we were able to make the vaccine available to many different countries on friendly terms, right? But look at what I'm not going to name some of those companies necessarily, but look at what some of the other companies did. It is deplorable. It's a barbaric act that they committed against some of the other countries where they asked for national assets, they asked for military assets in return for vaccines. It is atrocious. It is a blot on the human civilization that at a time of this sort of a crisis, you took advantage of that. You may have become rich, but you may be a technology, you may belong to a technology superior country. But look at what India has given. And I think this has been in some ways India's USP, that there is a general tendency to do good to the human world, right? I mean, you obviously want to remain ahead in some sense, but you also don't want to leave everybody behind. We have done that with AIDS.
Yes, I was thinking of that, in fact, the African countries, and the AIDS was an epidemic, when we were younger.
Right.
I was younger.
Right.
And you don't hear about it anymore. It's almost like, the generic cocktail of drugs that Indian companies did sort of stemmed that should have been the biggest calamity actually from a few decades ago. So now finally, Alok, you tell me, again, I want to be a little bit of I completely believe that we should invest in space. I completely believe it, efficient use of money, but I completely understand that cheap is not an objective, but efficiency definitely is. But what about the fact that say the phone, the little phone to the smartphone, that is a technology innovation. The better weather controlling techniques, to warn cyclones better. What if we, what would society be with India if we had this sort of incremental development in technology? We kept on advancing, but at a pace, and say India that invested in that sort of technology in say 30, 40 years from now, and an India that really has a vision to spend its money and its resources and its brains to really futuristic technology. Are we looking at a split society where countries who have done that investment are really going to go ahead in the race? What do we stand to lose if we just do this incremental, just make our lives better?
It's difficult to answer what would happen if we or envisage or foresee a society where, or foresee in India where you do a lot of, you invest heavily in science. But it's much easier to answer what happens if we don't fund it the heavily, and if we are just incremental in our approach. The consequences may not be that linear. You may stand to be in a situation maybe few decades later to be fully colonized again. I would not count that. And this time it may be even more brutal than some of the previous colonizations, because see, Earth's resources are getting more scant. We all know that. It's just finite. That's the reality of it. The population is just increasing. It will increase for some more time before maybe hopefully the world population flattening off and maybe hopefully decreasing over time. But resources are finite. There's an increasing number of people asking for that resources. And it better be in good hands, hands that are more equitable, that are more... so if you don't invest in science heavily, the only way of doing this, and history is filled with examples of those who did not invest in technology at the right time, having lost out and being actually even wiped out in some cases. Right? I mean, I can just think of so many different examples right now, but I don't want to go into all of that. But space is probably going. We don't know, but if 20 or 30 years later people do find a gold mine there, and by gold mine I don't mean gold, but something that is valuable, and if you are not there, you're out. You're just out of the race and prepare to be colonized again. The same is true for maybe for some of the other areas, including artificial intelligence.
Yes. In fact, it might also help us in our diagnostics and things, like, the way things are developing with that domain. Like we might actually land up being healthier human beings. I mean, like in healthcare and so many other domains.
Yeah, we probably will. I mean, it probably is going to help us out a lot. It may also be something that needs to be tamed later on if it grows beyond a certain critical thing. But again, these are discussions for people at the table.
True.
So if you don't invest in science, you're not at the table, you're not part of the table.
Actually, if you think of the moral dimensions right away, then you will not take that step forward. It's rather that we need to change our norms as technology evolves, rather than impede the development by sticking to tenets that will probably not be applicable for that time in the future. It may well be that way. Like today we think that the human mind should not be superseded. Even let me go back to clone.
Mm-hmm.
There's so many moral issues about cloning. But then when you look at what stem cells can do, you probably have to shift your goalposts a little bit, or allow. So the moral question, I feel, should not be the impediment to letting technology go far.
Yeah, and you should not become you shouldn't become a crowd at the cricket stadium with all these moral questions. You should have to be on the field.
Correct.
Even if you want to tackle them, you have to be on the field. True. So to be on the field, you need to invest.
Yeah.
And we'll be nowhere without that.
So thank you, Alok. Very, very enlightening discussion always with you. And yeah, make your space bricks, colonize space. Why not? Thank you so much.
Thanks, Alo. Thank you very much.
Always good talking.